Daniel's boots crunched softly against the bed of fallen leaves, the forest alive with the subtle symphony of nature. The rustle of the wind in the treetops, the chatter of distant birds, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath his feet accompanied him as he moved deeper into the woods. He didn't come here to hunt anymore, not like he used to. The rifle slung over his back was more of a relic, a habit he couldn't quite shake, though he hadn't fired it in years. Now, the forest was his refuge, a place where he could lose himself in the rhythms of the wild, away from the mistakes and guilt that shadowed his past. He paused by a stream, crouching to splash cool water on his face. The chill of it was refreshing, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the sun filtering through the trees. He closed his eyes, letting the moment ground him. For years, he'd been running, not from anyone else, but from himself. The animals he'd killed, the trophies he'd mounted on his walls, all for the thrill of it. He couldn't even remember when it had stopped feeling right, only that one day, as he stood over the lifeless body of a stag, he felt hollow. That was when he packed up and left, vowing never to hunt for sport again. His quiet reflection was interrupted by a sound, a faint, mournful cry carried on the wind. Daniel froze, his ears straining. At first, he thought it might be a trick of his imagination, a distortion of the wind or a distant animal. But there it was again, low and drawn out like the sound of something in pain. It sent a chill down his spine, not just because of its eerie quality, but because of the raw emotion it conveyed. Whatever was making that sound was suffering. Instinctively, he stood and followed the noise, his movements careful yet urgent. The sound grew louder as he pushed deeper into the forest, the terrain becoming rougher. The cries tugged at something inside him, something he couldn't ignore. For years, he'd been trying to atone for his past, but nothing he'd done had ever felt like enough. This felt different, a chance to do something real, something immediate. As he moved through a dense thicket, the cries became unmistakable, each one resonating with an almost human anguish. Finally, he broke through the underbrush and into a small clearing. What he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. A massive brown bear lay sprawled on the forest floor, its body trembling with effort as it struggled against the steel trap clamped around its paw. The trap's jagged metal teeth had dug deep into the flesh, and blood pooled beneath the animal, staining the dirt. Its chest heaved with labored breaths, and its dark eyes glistened with pain and exhaustion. For a moment, Daniel felt as though he were looking into the eyes of another person. The bear's suffering so raw and vivid it transcended the barriers between species. His first instinct was fear. The bear, even in its weakened state, was a creature of immense power. One wrong move, and it could easily kill him with a single swipe of its massive claws. His hand twitched toward the rifle on his back, but he stopped himself. No, this wasn't a predator threatening him. This was a creature in pain, a victim of cruelty. Daniel forced himself to take a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hey," he said softly, his voice trembling. "Hey there, big guy." The bear's head turned slightly, its gaze fixing on him. It growled low in its throat, a warning, but it didn't move to attack. Its eyes, those dark, soulful eyes, held his, as if searching for something. "I'm not going to hurt you," Daniel said, his voice steadying as he crouched slowly to the ground. He kept his movements deliberate and non-threatening, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm here to help." The bear huffed, a shuddering sound that seemed half growl, half sigh. It lay its head back down, either too tired or too resigned to resist. Daniel took that as a sign to move closer, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to keep his distance. This wasn't just about bravery. It was about trust, fragile and tenuous, balancing on the edge of a knife. As he approached, the smell of blood hit him, sharp and metallic. The trap was old and rusted, its edges jagged and cruel. It looked like the kind used by poachers, illegal and indiscriminate. Daniel felt a surge of anger. At the trap, at whoever had set it, at himself for being part of the same species that could inflict such pain. But he pushed those thoughts aside. The only thing that mattered now was freeing the bear. He knelt beside the animal, his hands hovering over the trap as he examined it. The mechanism was simple but corroded, and it would take effort to pry it open. He glanced at the bear, whose labored breaths filled the silence between them. "This is going to hurt," he murmured, not expecting the bear to understand but feeling the need to say it anyway. "But I promise, I'll get you out." Carefully, he gripped the trap, his fingers pressing against the rusty metal. The bear growled softly, its body tensing, but it didn't lash out. Daniel worked quickly, his hands shaking as he fought against the stubborn mechanism. His muscles burned with the effort, and sweat beaded on his forehead. At one point, the trap gave a sudden creak, and the bear let out a roar that echoed through the clearing. Daniel froze, his heart hammering, but the bear didn't move to attack. Instead, it simply lay there, its eyes wide and wild with pain. "Almost there," Daniel said, more to himself than the bear. With one final push, the trap snapped open. The bear roared again, jerking its paw free and scrambling back. Daniel fell onto his back, his chest heaving as adrenaline surged through him. For a moment, he thought the bear might turn on him, its pain and fear overriding its understanding of what he'd just done. But the bear simply stood there, staring at him. Its injured paw hung awkwardly, blood still dripping from the deep gash. Daniel slowly sat up, his hands raised. "You're free now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go on." The bear huffed again, its breath misting in the cool air. It took a few tentative steps backward, its gaze never leaving his. For a brief moment, something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement, a fragile connection. Then, with a final glance, the bear turned and limped into the trees, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. Daniel sat there for a long time, his mind racing. He didn't know why he'd done it, why he'd risked his life for a creature that could have easily killed him. But as the forest grew quiet again, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, faint but unmistakable. He stood, brushing himself off, and turned to leave. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of his encounter with the bear. Far from it. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall trees, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. Daniel stood outside his small cabin, sipping a mug of coffee. He was trying to shake off the lingering exhaustion from the events of the previous day. His muscles ached from the effort of prying open the trap, and his mind still buzzed with the intensity of the encounter with the bear. The bear. The memory of those deep, expressive eyes haunted him, and he wondered if the animal had made it through the night. The wound was severe, and though the creature had managed to limp away, he doubted it would survive without further help. He had debated going back into the woods to track it, to check if it was still alive, but a part of him knew how foolish that was. Wild animals didn't work that way. They didn't need or want his help. At least, that's what he told himself. He was about to turn back inside when a flicker of movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. He squinted, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized the hulking figure emerging from the trees. It was the bear. Daniel froze, his mug halfway to his lips. His first instinct was to retreat into the cabin and bolt the door, but something in the bear's demeanor stopped him. It wasn't charging or growling. It simply stood there, watching him. Its wounded paw was still held aloft, the injury clearly visible even from a distance. The blood had dried, leaving a dark stain against its fur, but the bear didn't appear as weak as it had the day before. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniel's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Why had the bear come back? Animals didn't seek out humans unless they were desperate or dangerous. He set his mug down on the porch railing, his movements slow and deliberate, and raised his hands. "It's you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" The bear huffed, a sound that was more breath than growl, and took a step closer. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. The bear's posture wasn't aggressive. It seemed hesitant, cautious, almost as if it were trying to communicate. "Are you hurt worse than I thought?" Daniel asked, knowing how absurd it was to talk to the animal. Still, the act of speaking steadied his nerves. He took a cautious step forward, then another. The bear didn't move, its dark eyes following him intently. When he was about 10 feet away, He stopped, unwilling to push his luck. The bear made a low, rumbling sound and turned slightly, as if to walk away. It paused, looking back at him, and took another step, then another. It was slow and deliberate, and Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. Was the bear waiting for him? "You want me to follow you?" he muttered, frowning. The bear snorted, shaking its massive head, and limped a few more paces before pausing again. There was no mistaking it now. It was leading him somewhere. Daniel hesitated. Every rational part of his brain told him to stay put, to retreat to the safety of his cabin and let the bear disappear into the forest. But another part of him, the part that had compelled him to free the bear in the first place, urged him to follow. He grabbed his jacket from the porch, checked the knife strapped to his belt, and cautiously began walking after the animal. The bear moved slowly, its injured paw forcing it to limp, but it seemed to know where it was going. Daniel followed at a distance, his senses on high alert. The forest seemed different this morning, quieter, more watchful. The usual chatter of birds and rustle of small animals was conspicuously absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that set his nerves on edge. As they moved deeper into the woods, Daniel began to notice subtle changes in the environment. The trees grew larger and older, their gnarled roots twisting like ancient veins across the forest floor. Moss blanketed everything, and the air grew cooler, carrying a faint, earthy scent that felt older than time. It was as if they had crossed an invisible threshold into another world, one untouched by human hands. "Where are you taking me?" Daniel muttered under his breath, his voice swallowed by the dense foliage. The bear didn't answer, of course, but it glanced back at him occasionally, its dark eyes flashing with an intelligence that unnerved him. He felt as though he were being judged, evaluated, as though the bear were weighing his worth. The idea was absurd, yet it clung to him like a shadow. After what felt like an hour of walking, the bear led him to a clearing unlike any he had ever seen. In the center stood a massive tree, its trunk impossibly wide and its branches stretching skyward like a cathedral. The ground around it was covered in a soft carpet of moss, and nestled among its roots was a stone altar. The altar was weathered and covered in moss, but Daniel could make out carvings on its surface, symbols and shapes that looked ancient, almost otherworldly. What is this place?" Daniel whispered, stepping closer to the tree. The air here felt heavy, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. It was as if the very forest was alive, watching him, waiting. The bear moved to the altar and stood beside it, lowering itself onto its haunches. It looked at Daniel expectantly, its gaze fixed on him. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. The carvings on the altar seemed to shimmer in the dappled sunlight, drawing his attention. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing the surface of the stone. As he touched it, a jolt of energy shot through him, and his vision blurred. Images flashed before his eyes, scenes of the forest in its prime, teeming with life, followed by visions of fire and destruction. He saw humans and animals fighting side by side, and among them was the bear, standing tall like a sentinel. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Daniel gasping for breath. He staggered back, his heart pounding. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, looking at the bear. The animal watched him silently, its expression unreadable. Daniel's hand fell to the object resting on the altar, a pendant carved from bone and gold. It was shaped like a claw, and it radiated the same strange energy as the altar. He picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm. It was warm, almost alive, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for him. The bear huffed again, rising to its feet. It nodded, or at least that's what it seemed like, and began to walk away, leaving Daniel standing in the clearing. He looked at the pendant, then at the retreating figure of the bear. He had no idea what he had just stumbled into, but one thing was clear: his encounter with the bear was far from over. The sharp crack of gunfire shattered the stillness of the forest, its echo bouncing off the towering trees. Daniel froze in mid-step, the sound sending a jolt of fear through him. He glanced at the bear, which had stopped abruptly, its massive head swiveling toward the noise. The animal growled low in its throat, a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath them. It wasn't a sound of fear, but of warning, a signal that danger was close. Daniel's heart raced as his mind raced through the possibilities. Hunters. The thought filled him with dread. This forest was supposed to be a sanctuary, untouched by poachers or trophy seekers, but he knew better than to underestimate the greed of humans. The bear shifted uneasily, its injured paw barely touching the ground, and glanced at him as if waiting for his reaction. "We need to move," Daniel whispered, his voice tight with urgency. He wasn't sure if the bear understood him, but it didn't matter. He gestured for the animal to follow and started leading them away from the direction of the gunfire, his steps quick but cautious. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual rustle of leaves and chirping of birds replaced by an oppressive silence. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps and the bear's labored breathing. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time, followed by the faint shouts of men. Daniel's stomach churned. They were closing in. He quickened his pace, scanning the dense foliage for a safe route. The bear followed, limping slightly, but keeping up. It was a surreal sight. Man and beast moving together, united by a shared sense of urgency. As they pushed deeper into the forest, Daniel's mind raced. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't even considered the possibility that the bear might attract hunters. Now, with the pendant in his pocket and the memory of the altar fresh in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at stake here than just the bear's life. The vision he'd seen, of fire, destruction, and the bear standing as a protector, flashed in his mind, its meaning still elusive but impossible to ignore. They reached a narrow ravine, its edges steep and lined with loose rocks. Daniel hesitated, glancing back at the bear. The animal huffed, its gaze fixed on the other side. "You can make it," he murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure. He climbed down carefully, using tree roots and rocks for support, and gestured for the bear to follow. The animal descended with surprising agility despite its injury, its massive paws gripping the uneven ground. When they reached the bottom, Daniel paused to catch his breath. The ravine offered temporary cover, its walls high enough to shield them from sight. He leaned against a boulder, wiping sweat from his brow, and looked at the bear. It sat nearby, its chest heaving as it rested. "You're one hell of a partner," Daniel said, managing a weak smile. The bear stared at him, unblinking, and he could almost feel the weight of its gaze. It wasn't just a wild animal. There was something more, something he couldn't quite define but felt in his bones. Their brief respite was cut short by the sound of voices. Daniel stiffened, his ears straining to pick up the words. The hunters were on the ridge above, their laughter carrying on the wind. He could make out snippets of their conversation. "It's got to be close. Big thing like that doesn't get far. Worth a fortune if we bag it. Think of the pelt." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. His stomach churned with anger and fear. These weren't ordinary hunters. They were poachers, their intentions clear and brutal. He glanced at the bear, which had risen to its feet, its body tense. It knew they were being hunted. "We can't stay here," Daniel whispered. He scanned the ravine, looking for a way out. The walls were steep, but there was a narrow path leading upward. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only option. He motioned for the bear to follow and started climbing, his movements quick but careful. The bear followed, its powerful limbs propelling it upward despite the awkward angle. They emerged from the ravine onto a thickly wooded slope. The dense trees provided some cover, but the hunters were close now, their voices growing louder. Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't outrun them, not with the bear injured and himself unarmed except for the knife at his belt. He needed a plan. Then he remembered the altar, the vision, the pendant. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the claw-shaped object, its surface warm against his skin. It pulsed faintly, as if alive, and he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The forest seemed to respond, the air growing heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. The pendant had led him here, but why? And what was he supposed to do with it? Before he could think further, the hunters appeared, emerging from the trees with their rifles raised. There were 3 of them, their faces hardened and determined. They stopped when they saw the bear, their eyes lighting up with a mix of greed and adrenaline. "Look at that," one of them said, his voice dripping with triumph. "Biggest damn bear I've ever seen," the bear growled, stepping in front of Daniel as if to shield him. Its fur bristled, and its injured paw hung awkwardly, but its posture was defiant. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped forward, putting himself between the hunters and the bear. "Leave it alone," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "It's injured. It's not a threat." The hunters laughed, their rifles trained on the animal. "Not a threat? That thing's worth more than your life, old man. Step aside." Daniel didn't move. He clenched the pendant in his fist, feeling its warmth spread through him. The forest seemed to hum around him, the trees swaying gently despite the still air. "You don't understand," he said. "This isn't just a bear. It's something more." The hunters exchanged glances, their laughter fading. One of them stepped forward, his rifle aimed at Daniel. "I'll say it one more time. Move." Before Daniel could respond, the bear let out a deafening roar. The sound shook the ground, reverberating through the trees. The hunters flinched, their grips on their rifles faltering. The bear lunged, its massive body a blur of motion despite its injury. Daniel ducked as chaos erupted around him. The forest seemed to come alive. Branches whipped through the air, leaves rustling with a sound like whispers. The ground trembled, and the hunters stumbled, their shouts turning to cries of fear. One of them dropped his rifle and fled, disappearing into the trees. The other two hesitated, their courage wavering as the bear charged. Daniel acted on instinct. He grabbed one of the fallen rifles and fired a shot into the air. The sound was deafening, and the remaining hunters froze. "Go," he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "Get out of here." The hunters didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran, their footsteps fading into the distance. When the forest fell silent again, Daniel lowered the rifle, his hands trembling. He turned to the bear, which stood in the center of the clearing, its chest heaving. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded. Daniel stepped forward, the pendant still clutched in his hand. "I don't know what you are," he said softly, "but I'll protect you. Whatever it takes." The bear huffed, its gaze steady. Together, they left the clearing, the forest closing around them like a shield. The fire crackled softly in front of Daniel's cabin, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Night had fallen, blanketing the forest in shadows. Daniel sat on a log near the fire, his hands cradling the claw-shaped pendant he had taken from the altar. Its surface seemed to pulse faintly, as if responding to his touch, but he couldn't begin to guess what it truly meant or why it felt so significant. The bear lay nearby, curled up at the edge of the clearing, its massive body rising and falling with each labored breath. The day's events had taken their toll on both of them, but they were alive, and for now, that was enough. Daniel glanced at the creature, marveling again at how it had stood beside him in the face of danger. The bear wasn't just an animal, it was something more. He could feel it in his bones, though he couldn't yet explain why. As the firelight flickered, the forest around him seemed to grow restless. The usual sounds of the night, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that set Daniel on edge. He stared into the darkness, his grip tightening on the pendant. Then, from the trees, a figure emerged. Daniel's heart leapt into his throat, and his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its movements fluid and deliberate. As it stepped into the firelight, Daniel saw that it was a man or something resembling a man. He wore a long, tattered cloak that seemed to blend into the darkness, and his face was obscured by a hood. Only his eyes were visible, glowing faintly like embers. Daniel rose slowly, his muscles tense. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the fear curling in his chest. "What do you want?" The cloaked figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, his gaze shifting to the bear, which had risen to its feet. The creature growled low, the sound reverberating through the clearing. "You've interfered," the man said finally, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to cut through the still air. "You've meddled in things you don't understand." Daniel frowned, his grip tightening on the pendant. "If you mean the bear, I didn't interfere. I helped it. Someone trapped it, and I let it go." The figure chuckled softly, a sound that sent a shiver down Daniel's spine. "You think this is about the bear?" He gestured toward the animal, his movements slow and deliberate. "This creature is no ordinary beast. It is a guardian, a sentinel of the old ways. And you've taken something that doesn't belong to you." Daniel glanced at the pendant in his hand, its faint glow illuminating his fingers. "This?" he asked, holding it up. "I didn't steal it. The bear led me to it. If anything, it gave it to me." The figure's eyes narrowed, their glow intensifying. "That object is a key," he said, his voice growing sharper. "A key to power beyond your comprehension. It was meant to remain hidden, guarded by the forest's protector. By taking it, you've disrupted the balance." Daniel's mind raced, piecing together fragments of what he'd seen and experienced. The vision at the altar, the bear's strange behavior, the hunters. They were all connected. "If it's so dangerous," he said, "why not destroy it? Why leave it out here in the woods?" The man's lips curled into a grim smile. "Because it cannot be destroyed. It is older than this forest, older than the mountains themselves. It is a fragment of the world's first fire, forged in the chaos of creation. It holds the power to shape the fate of all things, life and death, growth and decay. That is why it must remain hidden." Daniel looked at the pendant, its faint warmth a stark contrast to the cold fear creeping through him. He understood now why the bear had led him to it, why it had sought him out. The pendant wasn't just a relic. It was a responsibility, a burden he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. The cloaked figure took a step closer, and the bear snarled, its massive body tensing. "Hand it over," the man said, his voice dripping with menace. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Daniel hesitated. Every instinct told him to give the pendant to the stranger and be done with it. But something deep inside him, a quiet, unshakable certainty, told him that this man wasn't here to protect the forest or restore balance. He wanted the power for himself. "I don't trust you," Daniel said finally, his voice firm. "If the bear led me to this, there's a reason. And until I figure out what that reason is, I'm not giving it to anyone." The figure's glowing eyes flared with anger. "Foolish mortal," he hissed. "You think you can stand against forces beyond your understanding? That pendant will destroy you, just as it has destroyed countless others before you." "Maybe," Daniel said, his grip on the pendant tightening. "But I'm not handing it over to someone who creeps out of the woods in the middle of the night and starts making threats." The figure snarled, his body seeming to ripple with darkness. "So be it," he said, his voice a low growl. He raised a hand, and the air around him seemed to shimmer. Shadows coalesced, twisting into shapes that resembled wolves, dark, snarling creatures with eyes that glowed like the man's. They surged forward, their howls echoing through the clearing. The bear reacted instantly, stepping in front of Daniel and letting out a deafening roar. The sound shook the ground, and the shadow wolves hesitated, their forms flickering as if struggling to maintain their shape. The bear charged, its massive body colliding with the creatures in a flurry of claws and teeth. Daniel watched in awe as the animal fought with a ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. The pendant grew hotter in his hand, and Daniel felt a surge of energy course through him. The forest around him seemed to come alive, the trees swaying and creaking as if responding to his fear. Without thinking, he held the pendant aloft, its glow intensifying until it bathed the clearing in light. The shadow wolves recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist. The cloaked figure snarled, shielding his eyes from the light. "You don't know what you're doing," he shouted, his voice filled with fury and desperation. "You'll doom us all." The light flared brighter, and the figure let out a cry of pain before vanishing into the shadows. The clearing fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the bear's heavy breathing. Daniel lowered the pendant, its glow fading to a faint pulse. He looked at the bear which stood before him, its fur singed and bloodied, but its posture unbroken. Their eyes met, and Daniel felt a deep sense of connection, a bond forged in the heat of battle. "I don't know what's going on," he said softly, "but I'm with you. Whatever happens next, we face it together." The bear huffed, its gaze steady, and together they stood beneath the watchful canopy of the forest, the pendant's faint light a beacon in the darkness.